All right, folks, so today we are going to start talking about evolution. When it comes to evolution, there is some controversy over it, which as a scientist kind of boggles my mind. But most of the time, the issues with evolution is not that evolution doesn't occur, but arguments over the source of humans, okay? Human evolution. We're not going to go into human evolution in this course. We're just going to talk about evolution as a whole and the evidences for it. And so usually people who have a problem with evolution actually just really don't know what it is. And that's part of the issue. So we're going to try to fully explain what evolution is, how that it works, and what evidence we have for it. So evolution is a theory, but you have to remember that theory, the word theory means that it has been supported by multiple lines of evidence. And there's tons of evidence that evolution occurs. And we're going to be talking about some of that in this unit, okay? So a theory is on par with a law, okay? The only difference is that a law can be mathematically proven to work that way every time. And when we're talking about evolution and organisms changing over time, we will never know how organisms exactly changed under every possible instance. There's no way. So it will remain a theory regardless of the amount of evidence we have for it. So for now, we're going to go way back in time and talk about how these things really first started being thought about. And so the word we're going to start with is this word, abiogenesis. So we should know, hopefully, that bio stands for life because biology is the study of life. When you put an A in front of a word, it means not, so not life. And genesis means to make something. So abiogenesis is the production of life from non-living things. And so way, way a long time ago, people truly believed this. They believed that life could be made from non-living things, and they called this spontaneous generation. So what they thought is there was some kind of vital force in the air that could create life. Now, nowadays, we know there's no such thing as a vital force in the air, but what is in the air is things like bacteria and viruses and sometimes spores from plants. And when those things land on things and they're microscopic and you can't see them, they eventually grow into something. And so it appears that life might have grown from something non-living, when in reality it just grew from something that was microscopic and you can't see it with the naked eye. And we know that those things exist now because of the invention of the microscope. So people a long time ago, they believed in this idea of abiogenesis. And so the classic example of that was how maggots showed up on meat. So this was many, many, many years ago, and people didn't have refrigeration, so they would leave their meat out, and these maggots would just kind of show up. Now, we kind of know nowadays how that happens. How it happens is a fly lands on your food, and while the fly's on your food, it leaves little microscopic eggs. You guys have eaten more fly eggs in your lifetime than you ever realized, all right? Every time they land on your food, they're usually either leaving saliva, fecal matter, or eggs. So we know now that they leave eggs behind, and those tiny little microscopic eggs hatch out into maggots, and the maggots start very, very small, so they're not very noticeable, and then eventually they grow to a size when people look at their food and they're like, oh, there's maggots there, where did they come from? And so they did. They believed that this just occurred spontaneously, but we know this is not true. You love your little maggot babies. So one of the first scientists who took this on was Francesco Redi in the 1600s, and he was the first one to do a good solid experiment where he disproved spontaneous generation. So what he did here is he took jars of rotting meat, all right, so these jars, the first set he left open. This is the normal case. This is how people normally stored their food back then. And so by leaving it open, this was the control in his experiment, the normal case, right? It allowed the air in. So if there was some vital force in the air, you'd see tons of maggots, which you did, and the maggots then turned into flies. So then he tried a variable where he closed them, okay? And by closing them, it shuts off the air, and lo and behold, no maggots. Well, that didn't really help that much if there was a vital force in the air. So it's really his third setup that made all the difference. And this one, he put cloth over the top, cheesecloth in particular. And the cheesecloth has holes big enough for air to freely flow in and out of the jars, but the flies could not get in there. And because the flies could not get in there, they could not lay their little microscopic eggs. And so what ended up happening is the maggots were on the surface of the cheesecloth. So if it was something actually in the air, it would have been able to get into the jar and create life. But instead, it was something that was happening on the surface where the flies were landing. And so this was a very simple experiment, but also showed exactly what was going on, that there was not this vital force in the air. But how humans work is when some scientist tells us something, we don't automatically believe them. Sometimes it takes a lot more scientists and people still don't listen. But so people weren't totally convinced about this, okay? So then next we had this guy Spallanzani. Now Spallanzani, he also did not believe there was a vital force, and he's like, well, I'm going to prove it too in a different way than Redi. So he set out to disprove this life force theory, this vital force in the air. But what he did is he kind of messed up. He took broth and he boiled it, and by boiling the broth, that killed any microorganisms that were living in the broth. And then he left it open so air could get in, freely flow, and all this stuff grew. Well, how did it grow if he killed everything in the broth? Well, it grew in there because we know, again, that there are little spores from fungi and plants and bacteria in the air that get in there, but it's not the air itself that's a vital force. So then he boiled another batch and capped it, and lo and behold, nothing grew until he opened back up. So he accidentally actually supported the idea of this vital force, even though he did not believe in it. But we know what happened now. We know there's microorganisms in the air that are what is growing in there, and it's not the air itself. So it wasn't until a couple years later where Louis Pasteur, which you might know him from pasteurized milk, so he was a really well-known scientist, really well-respected in his career, okay? So he took Spallanzani's experiment and improved on it. So he said there's definitely no life force in the air, no vital force. So he took the flask that Spallanzani used, heated it up, and took the neck and kind of stretched it out into this S shape. And what the S shape does is it allows air to flow in and out freely, but any microorganisms in the air kind of get stuck in this little curve here. So he boiled the broth to kill anything that was in it, and then he let it go. Air can move in and out freely, but the microorganisms get caught. And so lo and behold, nothing grew. And the only thing he changed was the shape of the neck of the flask into that S-shaped flask. And so by doing this and then boiling it and breaking it off and look, oh, now stuff grows, there's something in the air that gets caught, he was able to show the errors in Spallanzani's experiment. And so at this point, because people already had a lot of faith in Pasteur, they started, getting on this bandwagon that yes, there must be stuff floating in the air and it's not the air itself that creates life. So now what we believe, instead of abiogenesis, is biogenesis, that all living things come up from other things. And one of our parts of our cell theory was that cells come from pre-existing cells. Cells come from other cells, and like you guys came from your mom and dad's cells when they produced you, right, through sexual reproduction. So if this is true, if this is how life goes, and we do believe that that is how life goes nowadays, how did life first start? If living things only come from living things, where did the first living thing come from? So this is where things get very complicated, and we have a lot of theories, and some just straight up hypotheses, and some that have evidence supporting them. Of course, that's a theory. So the 1930s, we had this guy, Oparin, who came up with a hypothesis. It was a hypothesis because he didn't actually test it at that time. He just had the idea, and he didn't test it at that time, probably because he didn't have the technology to do it. But Oparin said that spontaneous generation, or that first abiogenesis, did occur right at the beginning of life under certain circumstances. So we know what primitive Earth looked like. There's a lot of ways that we know what primitive Earth looks like. One is that there's little bubbles of gases trapped in ice cores that have been in glaciers for hundreds of thousands of years. All right, so we know kind of what the climate was like. by bubbles of atmosphere that get stuck in rock and ice cores. So he said that on primitive Earth, where it was very, very hot, and there was a lot of lightning or electrical charge going on, and in our atmosphere, we had all these gases. We had water vapor, which is H2O. We had hydrogen gas, which is H2. And we had methane, which was CH4. And we had ammonia, which is NH4. So we had carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, which if you remember back at the beginning of the year, when we learned our organic compounds, our carbohydrates, our lipids, our nucleic acids, all right, when we learned those guys, we learned they were made out of CHON, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Well, all those elements were present in our primitive atmosphere. Notice what's not present. There was no oxygen. No oxygen because plants had not evolved yet. So we had all these chemicals that could make our organic compounds. And so what happens is when you have chemicals and you add heat and electricity to them, they start to react, okay? So if you go on and take chemistry at any point and you're doing a chemical reaction, a lot of times you will be heating it up or adding an electrical current to make those things bond together. And creating something that is actually a precursor to life is kind of like winning the lottery, right? These chemicals combine, and most of the time they make nothing. It's just junk. But every now and then, something combines in just a way to make it more stable, and it sticks around. And those are our precursors to our current organic compounds. And so as our Earth cooled, these organic compounds went from being suspended in water vapor in the atmosphere to falling down as rain into the ocean. And this is called the primordial soup, because within this liquid was all these organic compounds, or the precursors to organic compounds. And we learned previous that water is the universal solvent. Things dissolve in water, and water is also what a lot of things react within. So again, once they go down into the primordial soup, they're going to further react and create more things. So this was just Oparin's theory. Like I said, he did not test this. So many years later, these two guys, Miller and Urey, in the 1950s, they actually set up an apparatus to test Oparin's hypothesis. And so what they did is they took all the gases that we know were in the atmosphere on primitive Earth, right? And then they added electricity, and they made it hot, and then they just let this thing run, basically. And it's been running from the time they made it in the 1950s till today. Like, this is still in a museum somewhere. I just can't remember which museum, sorry, but it's in a museum somewhere. And other scientists have built similar apparatuses to see what they can get. So anyways, they build the apparatus, and what they found in there are amino acids, which, remember, amino acids are the monomers of proteins. And they found some sugars, and these things they found relatively quickly, which was kind of surprising. Much quicker than they anticipated finding something like that, considering it took billions of years for life to evolve on our planet. And so again, it's like the lotto. Sometimes you hit it right away, and sometimes you don't. Most of the time you don't. So then, since then, scientists every now and then, they take a little sample out of this apparatus, just like a little drop of water, and they analyze it. And so since then, they found some more amino acids, because remember, there's 20 different amino acids from our mRNA chart we learned how to use. They found nucleotides. Nucleotides are the monomers of our nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. And they even found some ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is our energy compound that we use when we do cellular respiration or photosynthesis. And then even more surprising is they found these little bubbles. See these little bubbles in here? What these little bubbles are, these are called protocells. They are cells that form temporarily and then they dissolve. So they don't stick around a really long time. They're not very stable like our cells today, but they are made out of similar materials, and they could show how these compounds could combine to create a cell. So this is what the apparatus kind of looks like. Here is the chamber where they have all the gases, and again, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, all present. This is what they're using an electrode to put through an electric spark. The water is heated up to make water vapor, just like the primitive atmosphere. And so they just kind of let this stuff swirl around here, and then they have this that cools the water, and so the water vapor condenses, turns into liquid, And here's a little trap where you can take a little sample every now and then to see what's inside that liquid. Now, there are alternative theories. One of the theories that they say could have either replaced this theory that Oparin came up with, or it could be in addition to, is that meteorites from outer space may have brought some of our organic compounds, things like amino acids. And the reason why they say that is because when meteorites come through our atmosphere and land up hitting our ground, they can test them and actually find amino acids on them, which is really strange because, again, those are the precursors to proteins. So what were these doing in outer space? No idea. So all of this came to this theory that is widely accepted, though it's not something that's 100%, of course. There's some evidence that supports it, but it's not one of those cases like all scientists buy into this, but it's a pretty good thought out theory of the origin of life, okay? So what most scientists agree is these first molecules of life that were found in the primordial soup started to combine, and that they believe that actually created RNA before DNA. We're kind of trained to think of everything as starting with DNA because for us, that's our instructions. But in reality, RNA can do a lot more things than DNA can do on its own. DNA is just kind of like the records of what our body can do, whereas RNA actually does the work. And one of the other big supporting things of this is there are viruses called retroviruses that do their entire life cycle without any DNA at all. They do everything with RNA. So RNA, like DNA, can carry our genetic information, but it can also be copied like DNA. But the thing it can do that DNA cannot is it makes proteins. So remember, messenger RNA goes to the ribosomes and it makes the proteins using tRNA. DNA does not do any of that. It can also act like enzymes, and it can fold up and act like an energy source too. So there's a lot of things RNA can do chemically that DNA cannot. So what they think happened is we had this primordial soup with amino acids, and then we kind of don't know how we went from that to RNA, but because of that setup and the fact that we found nucleotides in there, that's good evidence that this could happen, that we could create RNA. And RNA too is half the size of DNA, so it's much more simple, and it might be why it developed first. And so from RNA, like what retroviruses do, they can actually make DNA from the RNA. So you can go backwards and kind of do it the other way. And so DNA may have been created, and then once it was created, that like stores our information that organisms, that worked well for organisms, and so they kept that. Most organisms start with DNA. So they think that this is how it occurred. And again, there's a lot of stuff about this that we don't really know yet and may never know, but it's a decent theory. So from there, in our primordial soup, we got the first proto-cells living in there, and we have fossils actually of some of the oldest cells. They exist, fossils of one cell that you can see on our microscope. As a matter of fact, these are pictures of them right there. So these fossils date back, the rock dates back to 3.5 billion years. Okay, so we believe the Earth is about 6.5 billion years old. So again, we think it took about 3 billion years roughly to create life. So that's a lot of time for chemicals to combine and combine and combine and just happen to win that lottery, right? So the first cells they believe were prokaryotic, which makes sense because eukaryote has a nucleus and has all those organelles. Pro-no has no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, so they're much simpler, so it makes sense that simple was made first. They were anaerobic, so remember aerobic has to do with what's in the air, it's oxygen, and when you put an "an" in front of it, it means not, so no oxygen, which makes sense because on primitive Earth, when life had not fully evolved yet, there were no plants to create oxygen, so they had to be anaerobic. They were also heterotrophic. Hetero means different. Trophic has to do with what they're eating. So they're eating different things. So they had no nucleus. They were very simple. They lived without oxygen, but they ate other things. So then you might be asking, okay, well, what were they eating? Well, if you have this giant pond of water with bunches of chemicals, organic compounds, and some beginning cells that ate other things, they were either eating the organic compounds or each other. And so if they were eating each other, which we suspect, then in order to survive, you had to have some kind of benefit. You had to have an advantage to survive. And so to survive, you either had to be very large and complex or very fast. And that's what we hypothesize happened there, that these guys were competing with each other to try to stay alive, and they started to evolve because you're going to have survival of the fittest at that point. So the first autotrophs after that, autotrophs automatically make their own food, so this is photosynthesis. These guys came much later, and we think they were similar to today's archaebacteria, which are very primitive bacteria that live in extreme environments. And they're still bacteria, still prokaryotic because they're simple, but they had some pigments in them. They had some chlorophyll where they could start making food. We also had some autotrophs that might have done chemosynthesis using chemicals to make food. These guys still exist today. They're down like in the thermal vents in the bottom of the ocean and live in extreme environments, all right? So the first photosynthetic cells increased, and then oxygen started showing up because they were doing photosynthesis, producing oxygen, using some of that carbon dioxide. And so we see a huge increase in the diversity of prokaryotes about 2.8 billion years ago. So remember, we got the oldest fossils we have found are about 3.5 billion years. So you're talking about more than 1 billion years later, that's a lot of years, is when we start getting all the variety of prokaryotes. So this took a long time, this beginning of life. Here's just a diagram showing chemosynthesis really briefly, how they do this. So in photosynthesis, they use water, carbon dioxide, and light. We're going to use carbon dioxide and water, but instead of light, they use hydrogen sulfide as an energy source, and they create sugar. So here's glucose, C6H12O6, and then they have these sulfur compounds that they give off. So back to our competitions here. So all this competition, these prokaryotes were all eating each other. And so with this, we had to at some point go from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells, which are your cells with a nucleus, right? Eukaryote, and had membrane-bound organelles. So how would we get there? Well, there's a theory again, endosymbiotic theory. So endo means in, symbiosis is when organisms live together. So they're living together and somebody's living in another one is what essentially happened. So imagine for a minute, you're in your primordial soup, and you have these two different kinds of prokaryotic cells. You have these little guys in the purple here who are very fast, all right? They create a lot of energy and they're very fast. And then you have the big guys. So that's the two ways that you can avoid being eaten. You have to be very large or very fast, right? So what happened is one of these really big guys swallowed one of these really fast guys at some point through endocytosis, right? In particular, phagocytosis. We learned that with cell transport. It makes a little vesicle around them and sucks them right in. But a mutation happened, which mutations have, especially when organisms are under pressure and the environment is changing. And so this mutation occurred where he did not digest this guy. And so instead, he started hanging out right inside there in the little vesicle, living within the other one. Now, this is a huge benefit to this big guy. And it's also a benefit to the little guy, because the little guy is kept safe within this large prokaryote. And what the large prokaryote got is energy. And so this bacteria has a name today. It's called a mitochondria. So the organelle that we call mitochondria is actually just bacteria that is living symbiotically in our cells. And so one of the things at the beginning of the year that I told you is that if you're an athlete, you're going to have more mitochondria than a couch potato. And that's not because you're born an athlete, okay? You can change yourself into being an athlete. What it is when your cells demand more energy, your mitochondria divide all on their own because they're actually their own cells. They're a cell within a cell, all right? And this is where things get crazy. So this is just a diagram kind of showing what happens. Here's the big guy, the little guys. He swallows them. Oh, they decide to live together instead of eating them, and then everything's great. So what's our evidence for endosymbiosis? Well, mitochondria and, believe it or not, chloroplasts, both those pill-shaped organelles, they actually each have their very own DNA. and their DNA is circular, like prokaryotic cells is, instead of linear, like ours is. So it's separate DNA from the DNA found in your nucleus. And so we inherit our mitochondria through our maternal line because it's the mother's egg that brings the mitochondria. And they have their own DNA, and chloroplasts work the same way. Chloroplasts are also bacteria living in plants. So the DNA resembles prokaryotic DNA. These guys can also reproduce on their own, which is what I was just talking about previously. And they have two membranes on them. One is their original membrane that they had, and one is the membrane from the vesicle that was formed around them, the one from the symbiote. And so that vesicle, the remnants of that are still there. So we believe they were taken up by phagocytosis. And so if we look closely at these guys, all right, so this is our chloroplast up here. And within the chloroplast, there is circular DNA. And here is an actual electron microscope picture of their little DNA all tangled up in there. But there it is, loose and floating around. And with our mitochondria in here, also has a circular DNA within the mitochondria. And so they have, like I said, their own DNA. And you can kind of see one of them right there. Okay. So we have this idea then how the first cells came to be. Pretty good idea. We have fossils of the prokaryotic cells. We know when they diversified. We have fossils of the first eukaryotic cells. So we have a rough timeline of when this stuff occurred and physical evidence that it occurred. Now, the specific steps of it, no, we don't know, and we probably will not know, and that's why, again, it remains a theory instead of a law. So from there, once you have one eukaryotic cells, organisms can continue to evolve and change, and the cells start living together like they do in protists, which we're going to be learning about soon. So now let's talk about full organisms and the fact that organisms change over time. So one of the first guys who started thinking about the fact that organisms change over time, because believe it or not, prior to this, everybody believed that animals were made one way and they never changed or adapted to their environment. Now we know that is different now. We know that organisms change and adapt as the environment changes. So LaMarck was one of those guys who was first guys like, hey, we know these guys change, but how do they change? And so what LaMarck said is that organisms acquire traits throughout their lifetime by using their bodies in new ways. And his classic example was the giraffe. So he said that giraffes originally had short necks, and this is true. The fossils of our ancestral giraffes have short necks. As a matter of fact, their closest living relative is called an okapi. And if you pull up a picture of an okapi, you'll see that they have this short little neck. They look like a horse with a giraffe head. So giraffes, they went out into the savannah, and they're born with these short necks, and they're trying to reach for food. And every day that they're reaching for food up in the trees, they're stretching their neck a little bit longer, a little bit longer. So LaMarck was correct in that you can acquire traits during your lifetime that would make you look different. There are a group of humans out there that put metal rings around their necks, and over time the necks get longer and longer. There are limitations to what you can do with your body, but you can modify your body in your lifetime. Now, where LaMarck was wrong is the idea that you could pass these characteristics onto your offspring, okay? So like if you dye your hair purple and you have your husband dye their hair purple and then you go and have a baby, your baby is not going to come out with purple hair. All right, this is a very good thing. It's like if your parents have tattoos and they go and make a baby, the baby does not come out with the same tattoos. Thank goodness, because think about some of the choices your parents may have made. Okay, it doesn't work that way. You have to change the DNA in the sex cells in order for it to be passed on. So while LaMarck was good in thinking about the fact that organisms did change over time, his mechanism of how this worked was totally wrong. There's no copy, by the way. They're super cute. All right, so this is that's LaMarck's idea that they stretch their neck every day. Now, Darwin came along and had a very different idea, and he was actually the only one, but he's the main guy. So Darwin is considered the father of evolution. And Darwin said that what happened is we have these different populations of giraffe, and when they're born, they have different length necks. Well, that's true, just like we have different height humans. And he says what happened is the giraffes with the tallest necks were able to get food and survive to reproduce. And the shorty neck giraffes starved and died. And that's what we typically see in nature. We see that there's variation in our populations, and then within that population, some are more fit than others, and the less fit are the ones that die off, leaving the best fit to survive and reproduce and pass on those genes to their offspring. And so that's how evolution really works. Once you're born with the genes you have, you can't really change your genes by natural means. And so instead, you are what you are, and you're either fit or you're not fit, okay, to make you work for that environment. So what evolution really is, and why it's not as scary as people think, is it's just change in a species over time. And the fancy one for that is descent with modification, all right? We are descended from somebody and we are modified from them. We are different, all right? Just like you guys are descended from your parents, but you're different from them because they produced you sexually, and so you're a combination of their genes. And so what most people don't argue with is dog evolution. So when you look at dogs, we all usually agree that dogs came from wolves. And so how did we get a little tiny floofy doggy like this, Yorkie down here, from a wolf? Well, what happened is we domesticated wolves, right? We started to get them coming near our settlements, and then we decided to tame them. So we picked the tamest wolves to keep, the ones that were least likely to tear your face off. And then if you want a small little floofy dog, what you would do is breed your wolves and take the smallest puppies, raise them, and then breed them together. And then out of their puppies, you would take the smallest ones and breed them together. And you keep doing that over generations until you created this tiny little floofy dog, right? So this is called artificial selection. Oop, I went too fast. And artificial selection is when humans pick the traits. Now, what Darwin was looking at is natural selection. Natural selection is when nature or the environment picks the traits. And so this is what we usually see, and that's what's going on here with my little chameleon. My little chameleon is picking off the beetles. Well, he's picking off the beetles that are mostly the ones that are easiest to see. And so what happens, the beetles that have the most camouflage to blend in with the plants are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce. So it is the environment that puts a pressure on the traits. In order for natural selection to occur, you've got to first have variation within your population. If everybody was exactly the same, you want to have that variation. It wouldn't be an issue. Typically with natural selection, there's some kind of competition between organisms as well. And sometimes it has to do with organisms being isolated in a certain place. And we'll talk about those more later. Then you can have sexual selection. Now, sexual selection is really interesting because this is when the mates are picking traits. And when sexual selection comes into play, some crazy stuff can happen with organisms. So a classic example is the peacock. So if you look at my peacock right here with these big feathers, this is not natural selection. Nature would never pick this because all those feathers make the male peacocks very heavy. They're not good at flying, and they have those bright colors that make them easy to spot so predators could find them and eat them. Now, if you look at the female peacock, she doesn't have those big feathers, and her colors are this, kind of bland brown color. She's not bright at all. And that's because the female peacock stays with the eggs and sits on them, whereas the male just impregnates her and fertilizes the eggs. So she looks that way so predators cannot find her or her babies. And so she can raise the babies to adulthood. And whereas these guys, they just come along, do their business after showing off to the females. And the reason why they have so many feathers like that is because that shows how fit they are. So if they are good at finding food and avoiding disease and predators, they're going to have this huge tail to show off to the females. And the females check it out and they say, yes, I like that, or no, I don't. So you can think of it like nowadays as a guy showing up with a really fancy car. If a guy shows up with a really fancy car, you say, hey, that's a guy who makes a lot of good money and could provide for his family. Let me go flirt with him. Whereas if a guy shows up with a junker vehicle that's half rusted out, you might be like, I'm probably going to have to take care of him. He might not be the best choice for me. Now, of course, with humans, there's other more complex things that we look at besides just what their car is like, I hope. But it's basically how things are working in nature. So again, with sexual selection, you have to have variation in your population, just like natural selection. So here I have I think these are grouse over here, and we have 3 different kinds. And so we have some competition for the mates. They all want to mate with this pretty female, and she has choice. She gets to pick. So this little sickly one, she's going to reject, because if she breeds with him, she might catch diseases from him, or he would pass on those genes for not being very successful at life to his offspring. This guy might look pretty good until this guy walks by, all right? So this is like the Dwayne Johnson or Channing Tatum, what's his name? Channing Tatum, that's it, of birds, right? So a good-looking bird, and she's going to say yes, because he's going to be able to provide for me, and he's going to pass on really good genes to my kids. So Charles Darwin was the guy who came up with this idea of natural selection. And he did this when he traveled to the Galapagos Islands. So he's actually kind of a bum. His mom was an heiress. His dad was a doctor. And he kind of didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. For a while, he was going to be a doctor just to make his dad happy. And then he was like, man, I don't really feel like doing that. And so his father got mad at him and said, hey, you're going to go on these trips, because that's something rich people did back then. They traveled on these ships for years, and then they shot things and brought them home to put them in their study so they could look fancy. It's kind of like their version of having a Gucci bag. So he signed his son up to be a companion for this captain, Captain Fitzgerald. And they did this for a reason, because the captains were educated. And the captains were not supposed to associate really with the crew. And the crew was like the dredges of society. These were not great guys. They were not educated either. And so they would bring a companion on for the captain to spend time with, so the captain basically didn't go insane. So Darwin was a companion to Fitzgerald, who was already by this point a little nutty. And they went on this multi-year trip. And one of the places they ended up going to was the Galapagos. On this trip, Charles Darwin was reading these books by another scientist called Lyell about how the land changes over time. And everybody pretty much accepted the fact that land changed over time, but they didn't think that organisms did. And so when he was out in the Galapagos, he started shooting a bunch of things. And at first, he actually didn't notice anything, okay? He just was shooting things and tagging them and keeping them for his study. And it was when he got home, and he actually donated a bunch of his specimens to Oxford University. And the professors at Oxford University contacted him and said, hey, did you mislabel some of these organisms? Because there's some variations here that don't make sense, especially if they were from the same place or there's different islands. What's going on here? This doesn't make sense. They should all be very similar. And so Darwin went back to the university and looked at the specimens and said, no, they're not mislabeled. There's something else going on here. And so this bugged him. He was curious, like, what's going on? And so he started thinking about it and thinking about the books he read from Lyell. And he said, you know, these guys are adapting to their different environments. They have changed, like the structure of their beak or the color of their feathers or how their shell is shaped if they were a turtle, to adapt to their environment. And so that's when he came up with evolution. And he said what drove evolution was nature selecting these traits, and that's the natural selection component of it. From there, he went forth and did a whole bunch of experiments himself with sea urchins and pigeons, and did a bunch of artificial selection, and he ended up writing a book called On the Origin of Species, which, if you ever go to read it, is very tedious to read, but it's a very, very good and complete book. All right, and so he spent really almost the rest of his life working on this book. And he didn't want to publish it because Darwin himself was actually a religious man and surrounded by people who were religious, and he was really worried about the backlash he would get from this. And it wasn't until another man named Wallace wrote an essay that basically said the same thing that Darwin had been saying in his manuscript. And when Darwin found out that Wallace was going to publish his work and Darwin's life work would have been worthless then, he immediately went and published it. And so that's where Charles Darwin beat out Wallace to be the father of evolution with this theory. He did think of it first. He just didn't publish it out of fear. So with Darwin's, we have some rules for natural selection, some things that have to happen. And I'm going to relate this to a population of frogs, okay? So the first rule is organisms have to differ. They have to have variation. So imagine a group of frogs. We're gonna start with some eggs, all right? Some frog eggs. So when frogs lay eggs, they lay literally most species. There's lots of different species, but thousands of eggs. So let's go with 4,000. Okay, let's say we have 4,000 frog eggs that were laid by a little froggy mom. 4,000 eggs. In those eggs, some of those eggs are going to not be fertilized. They weren't able to get fertilized. Some of them are going to get eaten by predators. Some of them are going to get like fungal diseases and die. So at best, maybe half of those are going to survive. So out of that 4,000 will be down to like 2,000, okay? So organisms produce more offspring than can survive. This is typically true, especially in nature. And some organisms, like frogs, produce large numbers of offspring knowing that a lot of them are going to die. Sea turtles are the same way. So let's say out of those frogs, eggs that survive, those 2,000, some of them, out of those 2,000, some of them are going to actually hatch into tadpoles. So let's maybe 1,000 actually make it to tadpoles. And so once they're tadpoles, they're competing for resources. So places to hide, they have to eat a lot of food in order to metamorphosize later. They have to be able to avoid predators. So they're going to compete with each other for these resources. Now, some of them are going to get picked off and eaten right away. Some get diseased, some get starved and don't find enough food. So out of that 1,000, let's say we get to 100 that actually make it to a froglet, which is a little tiny frog after they metamorphosize. After that, those froglets come out on land. Again, a bunch of them are going to be picked off right away by birds and things like that, snakes. Some of them will get stepped on, some of them will get diseases, some of them will starve. So out of those 100 or so, we might get down to like 20 that actually make it to the middle phase of being a frog. And from there, again, the same stuff happens. They get eaten, they get run over by cars. So at best, out of those original 4,000 eggs, maybe 1 or 2 of them will make it to adulthood in order to reproduce. And those frogs that make it to adulthood will be the frogs that are the best at finding food, avoiding predators, all right, being smart enough to avoid vehicles, and not likely to get disease. So they will be the most fit of the frogs, all right, the best frogs. And those guys then will have to compete to reproduce. So there's even more competition. And if they reproduce, they will pass on their best traits that allowed them to survive to that point onto their offspring. And so species alive today, we are all evolutionary winners if we're alive today. We are descended with modification because of sexual reproduction from our common ancestors that had the best traits. All right, so I can't wait to see part 2 of evolution, y'all. Bye.